Hi again. I'm going to talk about a game that I did a lot of the writing and narrative design for recently called Starship Commander. Starship Commander is a virtual reality game that is driven entirely by human speech, which means that there is no controller. Instead, you talk out loud to whatever character you want to talk to. The microphone on the Oculus picks you up. We take that audio and run it through our system, and then the character you spoke to responds. It's a game that you play by having an elongated conversation with the script. Now, there is a version of Starship Commander that is publicly available. It's in virtual reality arcades around the country. The team right now is working on bringing the arcade version to Steam, but it is also still in development. The arcade version is a couple of completed scenes that we would also like to include in the much bigger final version. So it is both released and still in development, which puts me in the weird position of not really understanding what type of talk I'm giving. I settled on the term mid-mortem, which I made up. But when I was thinking of what kind of talk to give, I think the most value I can offer is in kind of that post-mortem approach where we talk about what our strategies were and how we built them out and whether or not they did the things we thought they would, which, spoiler alert, no, they didn't. But I thought going through that relatively chronologically would be of the most value to everyone, but it also means we're going to kind of inevitably bump into the fact that we are still making this, and there are a lot of things we don't know. We have all our systems designed, and I can talk to you about all of them, but ultimately you never know what a system does until you put it in motion and see how people interact with it. So there are parts of the game that still might not work the way we think it's going to. So it is both an exploration of everything we have built and we do know and have play tested and have learned from and iterated on, and also a bit of an exploration about the fact that we are trying to do a new thing, and we're not totally sure how everything's going to work yet. So you know a little bit about who I am and who's talking at you. My name is David. I'm a freelance writer and narrative designer out of New York City. I am not technically an employee of Human Interact, the company that makes Starship Commander. They know I'm doing this. I'm not like in for a surprise when it shows up on YouTube. But I am a freelancer that they hired to be the sole writer and narrative designer on the project. So you can see sort of the different subjects that I'm going to want to cover up at the top. And at the end of each one, I'm going to try and de-selfish the talk a little bit and think of general takeaways that we can learn using any kind of story that uses speech recognition system and how a lot of people could build out these experiences. But you can see the first thing that I'm going to want to talk about is the technology. And I am not a particularly techie person. And I imagine there are a lot of people in this room that are also similar. This is a storytelling conference. But in this case, I really did want to highlight and talk about the technology first, because a defining facet of my experience making this game was the fact that when you're working with technology that's really disruptive, and I mean that in the sense that the speech recognition technology we were working with gave players a lot of agency. They could say anything they wanted to at any point they wanted to. There's no point in which the player can't talk. That both opened up a lot of cool doorways of things that only we could do that we knew we really wanted to take advantage of, but it also opened up a couple of Pandora's boxes of real design and production problems that we knew we had to approach carefully. So almost every decision I made about the narrative design, about the writing, was trying to work with the technology and figured out how we could highlight the parts of it we wanted to and either avoid or at least have some ability to contain potential problems that were coming up. So I'm going to try to get to the part where we talk about the fun storytelling stuff as quickly as I can, but I do think that conversation is going to be enhanced if we take like 10 minutes and just cover what it is we built and how it worked. So when we started building Starship Commander, we started with the decision that every studio has to make about every game what engine we wanted to build it in. At the time, we got started a few years ago. At the time, Unity was the best engine to work with VR in. But we actually decided to work with a slightly more complex version, is what I'll say, of VR in Unreal, because we really wanted to have Unreal's back end. We really wanted to have all of the tools Unreal had for all of the speech recognition stuff we wanted to do. There were two features in Unreal specifically that we really wanted. First was the blueprint system. If you guys aren't familiar with Blueprint, it is kind of like having Twine or Articy draft or a program like that embedded into the engine. And I say kind of because it behaves very similarly. It's about creating a flow of logic. And once you're used to nodes and branches and flow, you can learn Blueprint very easily. I picked it up very easily, having already worked in a lot of narrative engines like that. The trick is that while Twine and Articy draft are really for story logic and story flow, Blueprint is really for game logic and gameplay flow. It's about what buttons the player is pressing and how that changes all of the math and the numbers we're keeping track of and what that means for our animations and sound effects and enemy AI and all of that. So you build it in a similar way, but it's for a different type of logic. And usually those two logics are kept separately from each other. Right? In most games, when you are playing the actual gameplay, when you're participating in the combat or whatever it is you're doing, usually it doesn't affect the story. Usually whether or not I fight this one goblin or run away from it doesn't impact how the story ends up. Most of the time when the game logic is flowing, the story logic is kind of over here on pause, and then eventually we'll decide we want to do a scene, so we'll pause the gameplay, nothing's going to attack, you don't have to jump over anything. And you can decide what dialogue options you want to make, you can decide what path, what branch of the story you want to go down. Usually those are separate, and in our case that wasn't true. Because the only way that we had for the player to interact with the game was to speak to a character, was to speak to their ship. All of the gameplay that ended up happening flowed out of the story logic and out of the dialogue trees. So we needed one spot where we could build both of those in the same place and see all of it and see the entire flow all at once. And Blueprint was the answer to that, our answer to that. The other thing that Unreal did that we really wanted is it allowed us to build our own tools. And initially that was really important to the team. We actually initially attempted to build our own voice and speech recognition system before eventually deciding, let's just use something someone else has already built that's cleaner and quicker. But in that case, Unreal allowed us to really build in those outside sources to the code, to the engine in a way that was very effortless. Automatically, as soon as the Oculus microphone picked up what people were saying, we would send it out to Microsoft and Facebook's wit.ai program. We used those two services because they had the least amount of internet latency. And then it would send back text. And at that point, really, what we had to do is we had to build a glorified parser system for how we were going to figure out how we were going to make decisions about this text. So the first thing we needed this system to do is we really wanted the dialogue to feel natural. We wanted you to feel like you were talking to a person and to speak naturally, which meant there were hundreds of thousands of potential things that anybody could say at any point in time. We needed to funnel those down to a limited number of things we could actually build out and have responses to. So our programmers built this toolkit and this sort of flow of logic that we called the intent system, and it worked this way. Any individual idea or concept of something that the player could say was labeled an intent. So up there, you're looking at a question, where are we going, as an intent. It could also be, who are you? It could be a comment like, I think that's a bad idea. But any individual thing that somebody said and that we wanted to have a unique response to was an intent. Inside each intent, there was a list of utterances, and utterances were essentially all of the different ways somebody could phrase that intent. So if we were going to use who are you as an example, some of the utterances inside that might be, tell me about yourself, tell me a bit about yourself, what's your story, tell me your story. Those are all different ways of phrasing that same idea. So ultimately, utterances became all of the different ways a player could activate this one intent. And the last thing we needed to do is we needed to take those and be able to phrase them in the context of a specific conversation. Because what we're saying can mean very different things depending on the context. Like if I have an intent that's, as an example, if I tell a character, screw you, sometimes that's a joke. Sometimes that should be treated as a joke, sometimes it's not, and sometimes it shouldn't be. That's defined by the context of the conversation around it and what we were talking about before I say that. So those ended up being models. Models were essentially any one phase of a conversation, the context around it. So to give you a general sense of what the end flow ended up being, somebody would speak into the microphone. We would send it out to Facebook and Microsoft to get back text. The computer would then figure out what model am I in, which is something I would determine for it in Blueprint. Then it would check all of the intents inside that model and all of the utterances inside all of those intents, and then it would run an accuracy test. And the utterance that was the most similar to the text that Microsoft sent us back determined which intent would activate. And then we had all of that system hooked up to a custom node here in Blueprint that, depending on what the player said, would take it off on different branches of logic, and that's how our game would react to the player's speech. The one thing that I will say, that I will add before we wrap up tech, is that we did shoot with full motion video. That was how we created our content, partially because Sam Barlow made it okay again, but also partially because it was really quick and cheap and easy to do fast, which will become important when I revisit it again in 30 seconds. So deselfishing, takeaways, technology takeaways of what we can all learn from this. First, I would say don't try to build your own speech recognition system from scratch. It's tempting, and we had really great programs. We had really amazing programmers. And so what happened is they got from scratch, from nothing, to a functional model much faster and much easier than I thought they were going to. But then, as it turns out, getting from a functioning model to a good model is exponentially more difficult. It was like a siren that lured you in, and then there were rocks everywhere and your ship crashed. So I would say accept that you're going to need some kind of internet connection because those systems are actually very hard to build. Next, the ability to build your own tools ended up being huge for us. The Telltale guys just did a whole talk on how tools are able to make you iterate faster than you otherwise would be able to. And we had to iterate a lot, not just in terms of quality like everyone needs to do, but we also had to iterate just in terms of figuring out what our content was. Every single time we play tested, players would say things that we hadn't thought of that we then realized, crap, we should have an answer to that. We should have a line for that. So almost once a week, I had a new set of things players could say that I then had to write lines for. We would send it out, we would record it, we would plug it in. Every ounce of efficiency you can get out of your tools is multiplied 1,000-fold, and no engine is built specifically for this. So whatever you pick something you can build tools in. And lastly, on the subject of FMV, whatever content creation method you use, it should be efficient and fast because you're going to be constantly doing it. We're constantly creating new lines. And when you're using FMV, that's a fast process. If you have the equipment, you turn it on, you have the actors say their lines, you turn it off, you now have your content. Whatever you're going to do, make sure it can happen quickly because that loop of you constantly creating content is inescapable. It's throughout the entire development process, and you don't want it to drain too many resources. So, yay, now we can get to the fun part. At this point, we had developed a lot of the technology. We'd built it out in Unreal. We actually had a brief scene built as a tech demo to prove that you could speak to these characters and they would be able to listen to you. At this point, I was asked to come up with a plot, concept, and outline and structure that would fit the technology. And just returning to that idea briefly, there were a lot of really cool, exciting things that only we could do, and we wanted to make sure we had a story that capitalized on it. And there were also a lot of pitfalls that we thought we could use the story to kind of help mitigate. So I ended up coming up with a plot that was not necessarily about how excited I was as a writer to tell this story, but that I thought would fit the technology. And I was aiming to do it by thinking about these 4 things, which I will go through one at a time. First, we knew we wanted a story that branched very heavily. And we wanted that for a couple of reasons, but first and foremost, we wanted it for the reason you are looking at. This is a very, in the grand scheme of things, very, very small snippet of the script. But all of the lines that you're seeing on this script were all alternate lines, all alternate dialogue for a section of gameplay that it would take the average player roughly 15 to 25 seconds to get through. It's a lot. That's a lot of writing and recording and programming you have to do for that length of gameplay. So we knew we weren't going to be able to keep this up for a long experience. This was not going to be a 20-hour campaign. Even the fully fleshed out version of Starship Commander that we still want to make, we're aiming for a roughly 90-minute to 2-hour experience. So we knew it was going to be short, and that was complicated a little bit by the fact that we wanted to have a retail model. We wanted players comfortable dropping a little bit of money on it, even though it was really short. And so we were having conversations about what maybe we could do to encourage people that the length wouldn't be an issue. And a discussion we ended up having was that it's already kind of replayable, because we already have to have all of this alternate dialogue anyway. Just by virtue of the technology, we have to have lines and lines and lines, depending on what people are going to say. And what we thought, well, the door to a branching story is already then kind of half open. If you're going to have all of this alternate dialogue anyway, why not allow some of it to go somewhere? And it created a discussion around, that's interesting, players being able to find branches just by saying something specific, not because they were presented with a choice. So it was both a design element that we wanted to have and we wanted to explore, but it was also partially a business decision of let's branch, let's offer the player fresh value every time they replay it. The next was a concern that I specifically had. We did have to have a lot of writing, and as the only writer, I was very aware of that. But on top of that, what was actually more concerning to me was the amount of time it took to play test that writing, considering how much of it we had, specifically the utterances. Utterances in our system were not machine learned, they were all handwritten. Every time I wrote any kind of conversation, had any kind of intent, I would go in and try to think of all of the ways anyone could potentially make this point, which is, of course, impossible. It's impossible to think of everything that anyone could think of to make this one point. I can only think like me. Now, we had that figured out. We actually based our playtesting model off of the old parser games because our backend was so similar. What they would do is they would send out all of their games on floppy disks, have everyone play them, but it would record who said what where, and then they would recollect the disks, collect all of that data, and use it to make the game more intuitive. We, during every playtesting session, would be uncovering a lot of utterances that people were using to get to intents that we knew we had, but that I hadn't pre-thought of. So I would go back with pages of utterances and fill them all in after the fact, and eventually that worked. Once we did that enough times, it got to the point where people could play through a scene consistently and not have any hiccups. But it was a time-intensive process, and that concerned me on top of the raw amount of writing we were going to need to test. So I was trying to think of ways we would at least have a reason to contain that. And I couldn't think of any reasons or any ability really to contain the amount of utterances we would need. Really, the number of ways there are to say something in the English language is just a fact. There's nothing you can do about that. So instead, I focused on ways we could maybe contain the number of intents that we would be plausibly expected to have and respond to. And the idea was that if you could create specific contexts around scenes, you could control what does and doesn't feel natural to bring up in that scene. Essentially, I decided I wanted to write a thriller where every single scene has this imminent point of conflict and danger with a ticking clock element, because in that situation, it does not occur to players to ask, what's your mom's favorite color? Which is ridiculous, nobody ever asked that. But the idea was you could use the urgency of a situation to contain the number of things that both it would occur to people to ask, but it also gave us an easy option out anytime there was a subject we didn't want to talk about. Anytime someone made a comment or had a question that we hadn't thought of, a very logical character response would be, what does that matter right now? Can you please focus on the bomb? Next was the idea of surprise branches, which is what I called them. I don't think anyone else called them that. But it was the idea that when your player has an unlimited amount of agency, when they can say anything at any time, you have to face the eventuality that at some point, some player is going to say something that disrupts the way the plot is supposed to work. And it does not necessarily have to be a plot hole like the whole Eagle Mordor debacle, But when you think about our experience specifically, we wanted it to be replayable. We knew there were going to be people who are going to replay this game, be on a branch they've already been on, and therefore will know what happens next and will have the capacity to tell everybody about it. What do you do when your player says, hey, everybody, just so you know, Derek's about to betray us all in like 5 minutes? Now, on one hand, that was a problem, but on the other hand, we really were trying to think of it as an opportunity. Because that's something that can only happen in our system. If a player is clever enough to be able to disrupt what's supposed to happen with genuinely good story logic, we wanted to be able to reward them for that by actually having there be a concrete change in the story. But on the problem side, that also put us in a weird situation where all of a sudden we were at the risk of players dictating what kind of branches we needed to have where, rather than like our actual financial situation and reality and the amount of content we could create. So I wanted to think of a structure that could have a lot of these branches that we could add branches to as we needed to as these situations evolved, but where the creation of a new branch didn't necessarily mean the creation of a whole lot of new content for us to build. And lastly, there was a more general storytelling problem, but it was the idea of that knowledge gap between the player and the avatar character that they're supposed to be. Because in most situations, in most games, you're asking your players to role play as a person that has already existed in this fictional universe for a while and has a backstory and memories and maybe relationships with some other characters. And the player doesn't know any of that. Usually that's not a problem because most of the time as the writer, you're doing all of the writing for the character anyway. When you're allowing the player to make choices, it's really handing them a plate and saying, here are your dialogue options, which one would you like to pick? But I wrote them all, I can make sure they're all consistent. In our situation, the player was writing their own lines and they didn't know any of these things that this character was supposed to know in this universe. And we needed to find some kind of way of either making that plausible or helping the player out with figuring out how they're supposed to be this person. So with those 4 different elements I was thinking about, I ended up with this rough concept. I created a MacGuffin that I thought would solve some of these issues. This is the anomaly. It is a quantum star-like source of mystery and power that floats into the Milky Way galaxy from the depths of dark space. At the beginning of the story, humanity has it. They have control over it, but they don't know what it is. They don't know what it does. And in the opening scene, you, the player, play as a scientist that is trying to figure out what the anomaly is. You are going to be the first person to come into direct contact with it. You fly your little one-person ship into the anomaly in this scene. You merge with it, potentially explaining any strange memory loss or also potentially explaining why you, the player, know things about what's about to happen in the future of this because the character shouldn't know, but maybe you've experienced alternate timelines. We have some Galaxy Quest shenanigans going on. In the middle of this experiment, it is disrupted. You are all attacked by the Eknians, a race of warlike aliens. The anomaly disappears, it blinks out of existence, and goes somewhere else within the Milky Way galaxy. But the rest of the story is about you, the one person with this mysterious connection to the anomaly, and your military escort, Sergeant Sarah Pearson, exploring the Milky Way, trying to figure out what the anomaly is, where it's gone, and what the human and Eknian militaries both want to do with it when they find it. That concept solved a couple of those problems, but really what it did is it enabled me to make this structure, which I will preface with the fact that I normally try not to make plot structures that are this complicated, because no player has ever been deeply and profoundly touched by the complexity of your plot structure. That's never happened. It's not the point. But in this case, I did ramp up the complexity a little bit because this specific structure gave us a lot of freedom to improvise later on, and it solved a lot of those issues. So when I am working in a story where I think the chronology is going to be a problem, meaning there's so many things the player could do, there's so many different orders that they could do them in, I think I'm gonna have a really hard time drawing a consistent narrative thread through all of them. When I find myself in that situation, I really like working with mysteries. Because a mystery when you think about it, is really made of a lot of different tiny isolated pieces of information. A mystery is made up of clues. And those clues don't necessarily make sense individually, but when you put them together, they coagulate into the bigger picture of what is happening and why it matters. Once you have enough clues, it doesn't necessarily matter the order in which you got them. And as long as the clues are structured in a way that's clever, you don't necessarily need to have all of them. So it was a way of sprinkling a lot of story in a lot of different isolated places while also still having it come together to a bigger picture. Now this looks like mayhem, but it's actually relatively straightforward. I didn't figure this out until I was putting this talk together, but it's actually the exact same structure that Star Fox 64 has, funnily. When you start out in the prologue scene every single time. You start in the scene where you have an experiment with the anomaly. And then depending on the choices you make in that scene, we send you to one of 4 different tier 1 scenes. In any individual playthrough, you will only ever play any one of these missions. And these missions are all isolated from each other. The plot of each mission you go on is dependent on where you are in the Milky Way galaxy, what is happening in this part of the galaxy, and they don't directly relate to one and each other. So what you do in the defense array mission, where you are, what you're doing there, why you're doing it, does not necessarily connect to the Rescue Charles mission. So once you get to Rescue Charles, that mission will proceed as usual regardless of what missions you happen to play before it. But the reward for each one of those missions is a clue in the greater story of what's happening with the anomaly and why. And we did create this semblance of order. If you're going to play one of these scenes first, then a second one, then a third, for a couple of reasons. The first is it just made the mystery easier to write. There were fewer combinations of 5 clues that I had to make sense, and always had to get the player to the finale of where the anomaly was and why it's there and what it's doing there. But that was easier to do when I knew there's only ever going to be one tier 1 clue, but there will be one. There will only ever be one tier 2 clue, but there will be there. And it also gave me the ability to create a sense of progression, right? A good mystery isn't, I have 1 clue and it doesn't make sense, and I have 2 clues and it doesn't make sense, and I have 3 and 4 and they don't make sense, and I have 5 and now it's solved. You want to slowly build and curate a picture of what's happening and then start to correct it. Now that I have 2 clues, I get the sense that these are connected in this way, but I don't maybe know how. And now that I have a tier 3 clue, oh, that's different than what I thought, but it's starting to get clearer. And depending on the progression the player took through the game, they would get a slightly different version, a different perspective of what was happening with the anomaly and why. You couldn't understand everything about the story until you played through it multiple times. Now, the real purpose of this structure was to enable us to change around our branches relatively easily. Like, let's walk through an example. Let's say the player has played 1 playthrough of the game, and in the first playthrough, they participate in the alien ship mission. And they get that clue, that bit of information about the anomaly and all of the shenanigans going on. When they restart the game, technically that fact doesn't exist in the game, but the player still knows it, and it is still true. The story is the same every time. The player just gets different pieces of it. So potentially, the clue that the player learned in the alien ship, they might be able to use that bit of information to change the way the Traversal Memorial pans out. They might want to create a surprise branch there. And we could actually then reward them for that. We could say, you know what, let's let people do that. Let's let people create that change. Let's just make a branch that goes from the Traversal Memorial straight down to Caltech runes. They're not connected by anything else, so we can instead create different replay value by rearranging the flow of content that we all already have. The other component of this is it also allowed us to make cuts really easy. I imagine some of you looked at this and said, I thought you were worried about the amount of alternate dialogue you had to create, which, yes, is true. This was the grand vision of if everything went perfectly and we had infinite money, we could build this version. But also at any point, if we're running out of, either if we're running out of time, if there's a tech problem that we don't know how to solve, we can just say, you know what, let's not do the water factory, let's just get rid of it. Let's just cut the scene altogether. And the reality of the story structure is still intact. You could make tons and tons of cuts. And as long as you don't make too many cuts from any one tier, the actual story is still playable and still intact. So we could sort of decide as we went, what content do we like, what content don't we, what's working, what's not, and adjust ourselves from there. So deselfishing. And this is where the fact that this isn't a completely finished game comes into the picture, because we have built this system. We have this plan for what we're going to do with our structure, and we're still confident in it, but we also don't know exactly how players are going to interact with it until they do. Really, what we've gotten the most opportunity to play test and understand is scene design. We've tested a lot of individual scenes and a lot of individual conversations. And what I have learned from those playtest sessions actually has changed my opinion a little bit on those 4 factors I initially designed the plot around. That ability of the player to disrupt your plan by saying something smart, by having information that they shouldn't have. On some level, I still feel like that's important in the sense that it's plausible for anyone who creates any kind of story with this technology, so it's something that should at least be thought about. But the more I have play tested, the less and less I am convinced that any one individual player is going to try to do that. And we'll talk about that more once we get to scene design and how players actually were behaving with this system. Second, that player avatar knowledge gap, I do still think is a conversation worth having. It's something that you need to figure out, but it's more of a story problem than a structure problem, and there's all sorts of different approaches. You could take a D&D approach where none of these people have ever met your character before, and the player can make up anything they want, and it's valid. There's all sorts of ways you could do that, but it's still a thing worth navigating. Point number 3, we talked about how my investment in really taking surprise branches seriously has kind of gone down as I play tested. The opposite has happened for number 3. I've doubled down on your need to really use your plot to control the context of each scene. Because as it turns out, we will talk about in a second, but the players have a much superior experience when you actually do have a lot of control and you really can guide them through something specific. And then lastly, general tip from me to everybody, I like using mysteries whenever I'm having a hard time with a really complicated structure, because they can be broken up. They can be arranged in any order. It gives you a lot of freedom to do a lot of different things. So at this point, we had, we had our plot structure laid out. So it was time to start building individual conversations and individual scenes. The way that our just pipeline worked is I would draft something out in Twine first. There was no reason it needed to be Twine. We picked Twine honestly because it was free and we were kind of fibbing it anyway. It was mostly for me, it was mostly to see the flow and figure out what was going to happen. But I would draft it in Twine, I would then put it all into Blueprint myself, and I would then hand off the blueprint to our programmers so they could build all of the game logic around the dialogue tree and the dialogue flow. Now this scene that you were looking at is a very, very early draft. I think it might have even been the first draft I did. But it was a draft of a mission briefing. The idea was you were about to go on this mission, we explained it to you, and then you had the opportunity to ask questions. And I wanted to write this scene because I really wanted to figure out how questions were going to work. Because that was both a really cool potential for me. I really fell in love with the idea of you being able to fly around and being like, what's that planet? And there's just an answer. Of you being able to sort of explore this universe and the lore of it on a whim by asking about whatever you wanted to know about. That was fascinating to me. But it was also then the obvious question of how are we going to build that? How are we going to predict what questions people are going to ask? How do we know people are going to ask questions at all? How do we not know this isn't a huge waste of time? So we picked that first because I wanted to figure out questions. One thing we had learned from actually our very initial brief tech demo scene was that we really needed to have a way of allowing the conversation to continue regardless of what the player said if they happen to get stuck. Because in a system that is this open-ended, we really didn't have a plausible way of suggesting to the player what they should say to another human being right now without breaking the fourth wall in a way we didn't want to do. But when it is that open-ended and when you are waiting for the player to say something specific, like I'm ready or let's go, Ultimately, it's not going to occur to a lot of people to do that. There's a lot of people that are going to get stuck, not know what to say, and loop around in an endless spiral. So we tried to, in every scene we built, have a way of progressing automatically. In this scene, it was relatively straightforward. Each of these little horizontal clusters was one of the models. It was a phase of the conversation, and all the boxes were intents inside of that model. The models themselves we strung together in a pretty linear way. There was a model here. At some point would either the player progress through it or enough time had passed where the character said, you know what, the anomaly's out there, we gotta keep going, we gotta move. We can push you down to this next model down here that's a different phase of the conversation with different contexts and different reactions to what you might say. We did that in a very linear way. We didn't have a branch that went over here to this model over here and went down because it was too much. We, at that point, were using that plot context to make sure the player couldn't change the subject to something else. All of the characters could say, no, we really need to have this conversation right now. And we funneled them through it in a pretty linear way. It's just that within each model, there were a lot of different variations on what the player could do and how they would do it. This was our initial model for how we wanted the scenes to work. I sat down and started writing and immediately ran face first into a really big writing problem, which it's just that it is very, very difficult to write compelling dialogue when you only know what one half of the conversation is going to be. This will become a little bit more poignant if you know about me, so I'm going to take the opportunity to overshare. I really like Aaron Sorkin. I am self-trained at this. I went to school for theater, not specifically for writing. And so when I was teaching myself how to do this, I would come up with lists of all the different skills that I knew that I needed to have. And then I would pick the person that I thought was the best at those skills and would study them. When I was learning to write dialogue, I studied Aaron Sorkin. I must have watched The West Wing like 6 different times with a notebook taking notes. And one thing that Aaron Sorkin says about his dialogue, and I am wildly paraphrasing, is that the best form of dialogue is when one character can take what another character has just said, look at it in their hand and study it for a second, and then punch them in the face with it. Less colorfully, it's just the idea that good dialogue listens to itself. Dialogue should progress based on how each character reacts and builds upon what the last character just said. Characters set each other up. When you have a scene that is only dialogue, that is where all of your momentum is coming from. It's coming from the back and forth of these two characters trying to get what they want from what the other person just said and the point that they just made. It's also how you can very easily characterize people. You can characterize people by allowing them to react to what has just happened, and that reaction, a genuine reaction, can show who they are. I, in this first scene, was having a very difficult time characterizing my characters because I didn't know what they were reacting to. I didn't really know what the player just said. I knew the idea, I knew the intent, but I didn't know the words, I didn't know the tone, I didn't know the utterance. And so all of the dialogue that I was putting out was very generic. It was very vanilla. I wasn't in love with these people. It wasn't good writing. Now, in retrospect, I shouldn't have been concerned with that just yet. What actually ended up happening is it ended up being a gameplay problem and not a writing problem. And I'm going to return to that idea that when you are working with this speech recognition technology, your script and your gameplay systems are the same thing. So it wasn't that the writing was bad, it's that the flow of the activity was not fun. The flow of what the player was actually doing hadn't been found yet, and I couldn't figure out how to get my writing to fit into it. What I did is, at the time I had just been hired by this company, I was working for them about a month, and this was the first writing I was going to show them, and I really didn't want to show them bad writing. So I took the time to do some extra drafts and try to find voice. But what actually I should have been doing, what would have been more productive, would have been treating my initial draft in Twine not like a draft of a script, but like a paper prototype for the gameplay, to try and figure out if the actual activity of this specific conversation and the way it moves is fun. Fortunately, the way that it usually does, playtesting painfully jerked me in the correct direction. When we did start playtesting these scenes, we discovered something that I was very surprised by. In retrospect, it's not surprising at all. But at the time, it was very surprising and I was pretty disappointed, which is that players are actually really pretty bad at coming up with things to say. Most of the things that they said were incredibly short, very simple, a couple of words, one-word answers were very, very common. And really only 90% of players blasted through. 90% of players just did whatever they were told without getting into it, just yes, I'll do it, let's go, whatever. Only about 10% of players actually explored, what can I say to you? What boundaries can I push? Where does this system have a response for me and where does it not work? And even a smaller group, only a small group within that, actually took the time to ask questions and explore those big question-y branches in the dialogue tree that I had made. There were a lot of potential factors in why this could have been. One that we were aware of was that obviously it was a playtesting session. They know we're watching them, they're uncomfortable, they don't want to break our thing in front of us, even though we really want them to break our thing in front of us. But in retrospect, actually, the defining factor of why this is something that I first learned about when I read Jesse Schell's book, The Art of Game Design. In this book, he is talking about indirect control, and specifically, he's talking about constraints. And he illustrates his point by telling this story of when he was younger, he worked in a candy shop. And in this candy store, there was a specific type of candy that had 60+ flavors. It was the main feature of the store. And so all the customers would walk in and go, wow, what is that? What flavors do you have? And Jesse did the thing that most of us would do. He played up what was the most impressive aspect, how many choices there were. And he said, we have so many flavors. We have any flavor you could possibly think of, name a flavor, and I bet we have it. And for about an eighth of a second, people would be really impressed, and then they would actually try to make a decision. And they would immediately get overwhelmed, and they would shut down, and they would get frustrated that they shut down and would leave without buying anything. The point of this story is that we think of unlimited freedom as a good thing. But in reality, unlimited freedom shuts down our ability to actually make a decision. So in these sections, open-ended sections of the script, we would say, do you have any questions? Do you want to know about me? Do you want to know about your ship? Do you want to know about this planet, the aliens? What do you want to know about? Ask. People will go, I don't know. I don't have any questions. And we keep moving. The concept of asking about whatever you wanted to know about was an inherently unfun activity. Instead, what was consistently the most successful part of our playtest was a very brief moment early in the briefing scene where Sergeant Pearson is filling out some of your information and she would ask, how old are you? And we had written out a response of every age from like 5 to 95. Nobody came in with an answer we weren't prepared for. But what worked about that moment is because the constraints of the scene were very tight, we need to do this, I'm asking you this very specific question. There's no other background noise, there's no other branches we're concerned with, we're doing this one thing, and because we're doing one thing, we can really build out 90 different answers to this one question based on the specific details of what you said. And in that moment, players felt listened to. They felt like this system actually really understood them in a specific way and understood what they had said. And more importantly, because we knew what was going to happen, we had a funny little joke for every age. If you came in and said, I'm 43, we have a funny little joke about 43-year-olds for you. Now that did a couple of things. This call and response dialogue did a couple of things for us, but most importantly, it gave us a feedback loop. And most of you are probably familiar with some version of this concept. Actually, at the theater talk today, he mentioned it as, what was it, trigger and heap? He talked about that same principle. This is my version of it, but the idea is that it's the physical, concrete process by which people play a game. Players take some kind of action, which usually means that they push a button. That action has an effect inside the world of the game, but the loop isn't complete until the player is informed about the effects of their action through feedback. The player presses a button and it attacks a goblin. they will only understand the consequences of them pressing that button once we have an animation where the goblin staggers back and a little sound effect where it yells and a blood texture shows up from the floor. That's when they really understand what they did and are equipped to now take another action. Right. So what this gave for us is it gave us a way to immediately reward people for exactly what they had done, the very specifics of what they had said. And this is what I mean when I said I should have been looking at my first drafts as a paper prototype for the gameplay. I should have been looking for the fun in the activity itself. What actually ended up happening a bit in retrospect is we built out this intent system that allowed us to have all of these intents to go to all of these different places. But we realized the more intents we have, the more utterances we have to have for each one. The more directions we go, the more general we have to be, because the number of different things a player could potentially say at any one of them to end up at any one of them is so vast. We kind of went down that direction thinking all this freedom was going to be an amazing, great thing. But as it turns out that the freedom wasn't what players wanted. They wanted to be listened to very, very specifically. So to put it in a visual sense, we actually started out with these sort of wide, very, very sprawly dialogue trees, but players wouldn't explore them because they had no guidance of where they could go. They didn't really understand what they could do, what they couldn't do, and they would avoid it. We actually had much more success with player engagement once we moved into dialogue structures that looked more like this. And this is where controlling the context of each scene became very important. Your character could legitimately take the reins, focus in on this one thing that's very important that we have to do, say one thing, but then, because we're not doing anything else, we can create all of these different options and listen to the specific things of what each player said. Each utterance can become its own intent. And then we can respond to exactly what they said and the exact words that they used in a way that's immediately engaging and rewarding. The best benefit is that once we did start doing this, I immediately knew how to write again. I immediately had the ability to look at exactly what a player had said and bounce off of it in a way that used their own words. I could create dialogue that was engaging, and that became very important because the writing became a reward for the player's creativity. When the player said something specific, a little bit unique to them, we could respond to it in a way that was actually entertaining. We could respond in a way that had value in and of itself. And when we rewarded players for being creative, all of a sudden players started being creative. They started opening up. They started talking a little bit more as if they were talking to an actual person. So deselfishing, scene design takeaways. Use your early drafts to figure out what the flow of a conversation is. Do not concern yourself with the quality of the writing and the quality of the characters that I did. Remember, it's also going to be a game. You need to make the activity of having a conversation fun, and a lot of that is going to come down to the flow of a conversation and what you can do in it. Second, players do need guidance. The unlimited freedom of something like this is very exciting and very intimidating, but ultimately people will shut down if they feel like they have too many different options and don't know the merits of any of them. And lastly, where we really found our success in moment-to-moment players having a good time was the ability to listen specifically, to really break up, to really have a lot of different, very unique responses to not even necessarily the concept of what a player had said, but the way in which that player specifically had said it. So overall lessons, pick technology that you can control, pick technology you can build your own tools in, because we ended up doing so many iterations of every scene that was crucial. Your ability to customize your workflow was a huge deal. Do try to pick a plot where you can tightly control the context of a scene. And you can shut down any avenue of conversation that you don't want to go to, but realistically you won't even need to do that because players are so focused on the immediate intense situation. And that control becomes very important, again, because you do want to respond very specifically. That control reins everything in, so you can create tons and tons of alternate responses to one line of dialogue, as opposed to creating lots and lots of different generic subjects that the player probably won't explore anyway. Prototype your scenes and use writing as a reward for creativity. Your writing should have entertainment value in and of itself, because that is the treat. That's the bit of reward that's going to create that Pavlovian loop where your player now wants to keep going because the last thing they said was so much fun, they want to try one more thing. This is my contact information. This is the information of everybody. That's it. Thank you. We are done earlier than I thought we'd be. We have 10 minutes for questions if anybody has any. No, we stuck with wit.ai and Facebook. Really, our concern with those systems was the latency, and especially the latency at a lot of trade shows. And what we found when they were doing the tests, they found that most of them functioned almost identically. It was just the speed at which they could do it was the only difference. So those were the fastest. That was why we picked those two. But they worked great. That worked perfectly. That's a great question. I mean, the reality is that I don't know if we had any plans to port this to other languages, but we knew regional testing, local testing, just to the way different people spoke in different regions was huge, because we would play test a scene a bunch of times in New York, and because of the way people in New York naturally spoke, the way they learned to speak, a scene would flow great. And then we would take it out to the West Coast, and people would have different ways of putting the same idea together, and it would get stumped. So actually a big part of what we discovered we had to do with the play testing process was take it around to a lot of different local areas and figure out how do people talk here, and can our system handle that? Yeah, it was a manual process of just taking it around, showing it to a lot of people. That's why we tried to do, we tried to do a lot of shows, both to just get some visibility, but also we approached every show that we took the game to as its own playtesting session for that region. So we would actually always have someone, whenever people were playing, just with a notebook, recording like, oh, they said this. We don't have that. Yep, that didn't work. That didn't work for them. It's broken. But so that was our main process, actually taking it to shows was how we did that. I mean, the reality was that there was an element of delay we couldn't avoid. What we ended up doing is we disguised it a little bit, because you are in your ship in the entire show. We disguised it as static. Anytime we needed to buy a second, the screen would fizzle any bit, and then they heard you, and then they'd talk to you. We actually also stitched some lines together that same way, where we would have one beginning of a line, some static to change the fact that we're moving video files, and then now this is the second half of what I wanted to say to you. We found that actually, strangely, so there's a certain element that, at least from my position, was out of my hands, because that was up to wit.ai and Microsoft. But we found that most accents actually came back relatively stable. The biggest problem that we had was ambient noise in the room, disrupting what people said. But actually, we found that most people I remember we were very pleasantly surprised of people, for whatever reason, I don't know why, but people with Asian accents were understood very easily by the system for some reason. So on some level, that tech worked better than we thought it would, but also from my perspective, there was very little we could do about that once we decided to use an outside service for the actual speech-to-text translation. If it didn't understand, most of the time it went to a context of, if I didn't understand, it would automatically assume you asked something we don't have the answer to. So the context it was go to was, why does that matter? Can we focus on the bomb? Is usually what happened, which most time then players would just assume, okay, it doesn't have that, not it didn't understand me. So for the first question, I'm going to preface it by saying ultimately I don't know if money changed hands or how much changed hands because I'm a freelancer, so I wasn't privy to that part of the company. But what I did know is that oftentimes Human Interact was capable of making deals with those technologies because they were so excited to have some form of entertainment that would advertise how great this service was. Most of the services we used were very excited about us having us use that service. And the second, in terms of how long it's playable, my understanding of the backend was that this connection to Microsoft and wit.ai was really only in one spot in the programming. It was a part of the engine code. It was not something we had to pull up on every blueprint, which meant that if we needed to switch services, there was really only one change we needed to make. Now, whether or not that would have caused problems in the sense that like one service favors one word more than another, and that skewed our backend, I don't know, but it would have been relatively easy to change services if we need to, at least from a technical perspective. What I would say is that my experience with it, and especially deciding what story I wanted to tell, was that certain types of stories are more meandering than others, and you do not want a type of story that meanders. Like actually, what I learned about having this sci-fi game, and that was a genre we knew we were going to do, partially because the gameplay was so fun. You could say, you know, computer shields up, and it would do stuff. Like that was a cool activity to have. But it left us with this sci-fi world, and when I think of sci-fi and fantasy, I usually think of the setting as a huge star, which is why I wanted to explore the idea of questions. Can you ask? There's a history to this place. I want you to be a part of it. And ultimately, we found that meandering was both not a fun activity and very difficult to build. So in terms of certain genres of story, I would say plot-driven stories, like thrillers specifically, or maybe a very strong character-driven story like a romance might work really well if you really spend time on one person's tree and having both a lot of different dialogue options and are able to listen very specifically for all of those things. That might work, but anything that is a little bit too wandering or literary or about the place seemed like a difficult fit for the technology for me. For figuring out what the scope of the writing was, honestly, I had no idea because we didn't know how many lines we were going to need to have. We didn't know how many surprises we were going to get from our players that like logically we should have a response to. And that's part of why I wanted to create a plot structure where we could make cuts really easy, is I had no idea how much content we would need, and I knew if we create a story where everything really depends on the exact thing that just happened before it, we could find ourselves in a position where, as it turns out, that's more content than we were prepared to make, and now we're stuck in this death spiral. So I really didn't have a way of measuring how much work we were going to need to do, and instead my response to that was, let's make this picture and make sure we can cut as much of it out of it as we need to once that becomes more clear. Actually, at first, and then we should go, I'll be out in the hallway if anyone has more questions. Actually, one thing that I tried to do, which was moderately effective, and then we ended up not needing to do it, but what I decided to do was, especially when we were exploring the idea of like asking questions, figuring that out, I would drop sci-fi terms with no context about it, because this is a character who theoretically has amnesia. If an NPC drops the word Echnian with no context around it, the logical assumption is that most first-time players are going to ask what an Echnian is. And then you can take them a response that leads them to a slightly deeper, more complicated question that you really wanted them to ask. I use that as a way of both trying to teach people you can ask questions at the time where we were still attempting to do that, and also as a way of predicting the flow of most first-time players through the first time that they played the game. But what we ended up realizing is like, wow, really just compacting these and making it a more linear experience with lots of ways to react to people was more fun. So we ended up dropping the need to do that. But that was something that we explored, and it was marginally successful when we were doing it. We are done. I need to shut down, but I'll be outside.